pilgrim, but as a man possessed by ambition, a leader determined to convert adversity into opportunity. The sectarians, who had long suffered under excommunication, persecution, and public scorn, eagerly gathered around him, perceiving in his presence the promise of vindication. Frank preached with a fiery eloquence, explaining that the hardships they had endured were part of a divine plan, and that just as Sabbatai Zevi had been forced to feign conversion to Islam to accomplish the will of God, so too were they destined to adopt Christianity temporarily. This radical interpretation of faith was intended not only to protect them from the Orthodox Jewish authorities, but also to prepare them for the mystical fulfillment of salvation. The audacity of the plan electrified his followers, instilling both hope and fanaticism. At the same time, Frank's disciples, intoxicated by years of clandestine worship, sought revenge against the Jews who had shunned them and the rabbis who had condemned their practices. They seized upon one of the most dangerous accusations of the period, the ritual murder charge, a heinous and false claim that Jews abducted and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rites. The accusation had been circulating across Poland and Eastern Europe, inflaming anti-Semitic sentiment and leading to violent attacks on Jewish communities. Frank and his sectarians saw in this accusation a weapon to manipulate Christian authorities. By lending their testimony to the claim, they could appear as pious, penitent converts, while simultaneously turning the tide against their former persecutors. The audacity of this strategy was staggering. Here were Jews, themselves the targets of centuries of suspicion and persecution, proposing to adopt the religion of their oppressors, align with the Christian authorities, and exploit a libel that had historically endangered Jewish lives, all in the pursuit of mystical and earthly power. Jacob Frank justified these actions through his own Kabbalistic reasoning, claiming that the transgression of conventional morality and the inversion of law were necessary for the ultimate redemption of his people. By the end of the year 1758, the Frankist movement had entered a new, dangerous phase. Frank's charisma and his promises of divine revelation bound the sectarians to him with almost absolute loyalty. They began to present themselves publicly in Christian towns, adopting the trappings of Christianity, attending Mass, and performing acts of outward devotion, all while retaining the mystical Sabbatian practices in secret. In this audacious double life, they sought simultaneously to escape the scrutiny of the rabbis and to manipulate the authorities who had once threatened their lives. The Polish Jewish communities, already weakened by decades of social, economic, and spiritual upheaval, watched these events with alarm and horror. The rabbis, powerless to suppress the clandestine gatherings and secret teachings of the Frankists, feared that their doctrines, built on mysticism, seduction, and the deliberate inversion of moral law, would spread beyond Podolia and Galicia, destabilizing Jewish life across the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The stage was set for a confrontation that was at once spiritual, social, and political. A confrontation in which faith, fanaticism, and ambition would collide in ways that would shape the destiny of Polish Jewry for decades to come. The story of Jacob Frank and his followers during this period is one of intrigue, deception, and religious audacity on an almost unimaginable scale. While the Catholic authorities believed they had secured the loyalty of the Frankists through baptism and ceremonial conversion, the reality was far more complex. Frank, now known by his Christian name Joseph, had transformed imprisonment into a new theater of power. From the citadel of Czestochow, he continued to dictate the doctrines and rituals of his sect, maintaining the illusion of holiness and messianic authority that had long bound his followers to him. The Frankists, numbering hundreds, settled on the outskirts of Czestochow, in a district they called the Gates of Rome, interpreting their proximity to the citadel as a mystical symbol of closeness to divine power. Here, they lived in anticipation of miraculous events, convinced that their leaders' suffering mirrored the fate of Sabbatai Zevi, the false messiah of the 17th century. Frank's letters and secret communications from within the citadel instructed his followers in the peculiar doctrines of the new faith, which he termed the Holy Religion of Edom. This religion was a complex amalgamation of Christian ritual, Sabbatean mysticism, and Frank's own reinterpretations of Jewish law. It was designed not to inspire morality or spiritual enlightenment, but to subvert traditional structures of law, custom, and authority. To the Catholic authorities, the imprisonment of Frank seemed a complete success. They assumed that the Frankists, having publicly adopted Christianity, were now loyal subjects of both church and crown. They could not have imagined that the so-called Holy Lord, confined behind the fortress walls, continued to dominate the spiritual and intellectual lives of his followers, manipulating their devotion and guiding their mystical practices. The letters smuggled out of the citadel, full of Kabbalistic symbols, apocalyptic predictions, and arcane exhortations, became objects of veneration. Every hardship endured by the sectarians, every act of persecution, was interpreted as proof that Frank was a suffering Messiah, destined to triumph over the forces of the Orthodox Jewish community and the skeptical Christian authorities alike. Despite the seeming passivity of their leader, the Frankists began to display extraordinary organizational skill. They collected funds for Frank's upkeep, sent representatives to Polish towns to enforce loyalty, and engaged in secret proselytism among those already vulnerable to mystical and messianic ideas. The blend of fear, fascination, and ambition bound them into a cohesive sect. The ordinary population, both Jewish and Christian, was perplexed, scandalized, and in some quarters even intimidated by the boldness of the group. The Frankists openly challenged the moral and legal authority of the Jewish Kahals while cloaking their allegiance to Christianity in a carefully constructed veil of piety. In the eyes of Jacob Frank's followers, the period of his imprisonment was a time of sanctification, a proving ground that elevated him to the status of a living, suffering Messiah. They saw in his captivity a symbol of the divine plan, a ritual drama that legitimized the abandonment of traditional Jewish law and the embrace of their esoteric and subversive doctrines. To the outside observer, however, the spectacle was one of cynicism, opportunism, and the audacious manipulation of faith. Frank's declaration that his mission was to abolish all laws and statutes, Jewish, Christian, and civil, underscored the radical and dangerous character of his movement. It was no longer merely a heretical sect. It was a force that sought to upend existing religious and social structures entirely, operating simultaneously in secrecy and in bold public gestures, in the shadow of authority and in defiance of it. The tension between the Frankists and the Orthodox rabbis, between the sect and the Catholic authorities, and between the mystical aspirations of the sect and the cynical ambition of its leader, created an atmosphere of perpetual drama. Letters and emissaries passed in secrecy. Clandestine gatherings were held in courtyards and private houses, and the followers of Frank lived in constant oscillation between fear of persecution and fervor for mystical revelation. Every decree of the church, every act of rabbinical censure, every rumor from Warsaw or Lemberg became a catalyst for renewed zeal, further embedding the Frankist movement into the turbulent religious landscape of 18th century Poland and Podolia. The audacity of Jacob Frank, his capacity to inspire devotion even from within prison walls, and the unshakable loyalty of his sect created a paradox. The imprisoned Messiah controlled a community whose influence extended across towns and provinces, threatening both traditional Jewish society and the cautious oversight of the Catholic Church. It was an era in which mysticism, ambition, and subversion converged in a drama of faith, secrecy, and intrigue, setting the stage for consequences that would ripple across Poland, Galicia, and Podolia for decades to come. The emergence of Hasidism, known as the doctrine of piety, represented a profound turning point in the spiritual life of Polish Jewry. Unlike the morbid mysticism of the Frankists or the rigid scholasticism of the Talmudists in Lithuania and White Russia, Hasidism spoke directly to the hearts of the common people. Its founder, Israel ben Eliezer, better known by the sobriquet Baal Shem Tov, meaning Master of the Good Name, was born around the year 1698 in the small town of Okapi, in the region of Podolia. He was the son of Eleazar and Sarah, members of the humble Jewish population, and grew up in the midst of the superstitions, Kabbalistic influences, and mystical traditions that were widespread in southwestern Polish and Ukrainian Jewry. From an early age, Israel demonstrated a rare combination of piety, mystical insight, and personal magnetism. While he studied the Talmud and other traditional texts, his true genius lay in his ability to perceive the spiritual needs of the ordinary Jewish population, those who were alienated from the cold, arcane debates of the rabbinic elite. Baal Shem Tov recognized that mere scholarship was insufficient to satisfy the yearning for closeness to God, for meaning in suffering, and for the reassurance of divine presence in daily life. He sought to bring a direct, personal, and joyous experience of God into the homes and hearts of the Jewish people. By the middle of the 18th century, Israel Baal Shem Tov had become a revered figure in the villages and towns of Podolia and Galicia. Pilgrims and seekers traveled long distances to hear his teachings, to witness his miracles, and to be uplifted by the charisma and warmth with which he imparted religious counsel. These miracles, often simple but deeply symbolic, included healings, blessings for children, and prayers that brought comfort to the afflicted. Unlike the Frankists, who blended deception, political cunning, and mystical posturing, the Baal Shem Tov's influence was rooted in genuine spiritual authority and moral integrity. The teachings of Hasidism were revolutionary in their simplicity and accessibility. Baal Shem Tov emphasized joy, sincerity, and devotion in the worship of God, rather than the rigid memorization and legalistic arguments that dominated the Talmudic academies. Prayer, song, and storytelling became vehicles for spiritual elevation, while mystical interpretation of Scripture allowed even the unlearned to glimpse the hidden truths of the divine world. Hasidism did not reject the Talmud outright, but sought to transform it from an abstract exercise in legalism into a living, breathing source of inspiration for everyday life. The appeal of Hasidism spread rapidly, especially among the peasants, artisans, and rural Jews who had suffered from centuries of instability, pogroms, and economic hardship. The movement gave them a sense of identity, community, and hope, replacing the disillusionment left by Sabbatian and Frankist movements with an accessible, heartfelt, and deeply personal faith. The Baal Shem Tov, with his tales, parables, and demonstrations of spiritual power, became the first true Maggid, a preacher and spiritual guide of the Hasidic movement, a figure who combined mysticism, morality, and leadership in a way that resonated with the lived experience of the common people. Meanwhile, the rabbinic elite of the northeastern provinces, firmly rooted in Lithuania and White Russia, looked on with suspicion and growing hostility. They viewed the emotional and ecstatic practices of the Hasidim, singing, dancing, and open expressions of devotion, as a threat to the established order of Talmudic authority. The conflict between Hasidism and Rabbinism would grow in intensity, yet the movement's ability to meet the spiritual needs of ordinary Jews, particularly in southwestern Poland, Podolia, and Volhynia, ensured its rapid expansion. By the latter decades of the 18th century, Hasidism had established its first dynasties, led by charismatic followers of Baal Shem Tov, who continued his work in towns and villages across Podolia, Galicia, and Volhynia. These leaders, later known as Rebbes, combined spiritual insight, moral authority, and personal magnetism, guiding communities and offering solace in times of persecution and hardship. The movement's emphasis on joy, mystical devotion, and communal solidarity created a spiritual lifeline for Jews who had endured centuries of war, displacement, and oppression. The Hasidic movement, in its earliest form, thus arose not in the grand halls of academic study or the palaces of kings, but in the small villages and rural landscapes of southwestern Polish Jewry, where the echoes of past messianic disappointments, Sabbatian fanaticism, and Frankist subversion had left a spiritual void. Israel Baal Shem Tov's brilliance lay in his ability to fill that void, to provide a framework for piety, joy, and mystical connection that spoke directly to the heart, and to ignite a movement that would transform Jewish religious life for generations to come. The stage was set. While the northern rabbinic world remained bound by tradition and legalistic scholarship, the South was alive with ecstatic devotion and the promise of spiritual renewal, heralding the rise of Hasidism as the dominant force in the heart and soul of Polish Jewry. Israel Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, soon became more than a mere healer. He became a living symbol of hope for a people long battered by oppression, displacement, and the ceaseless intrigues of heterodox sections. The townspeople of Tlusta and the surrounding villages marveled at his powers. Sick children were cured, barren women were blessed with offspring, and the misfortunes of everyday life, poverty, disease, misfortune, were met with the reassuring presence of the Baal Shem Tov, whose words and prayers carried an almost tangible warmth. His fame spread like wildfire across the southwestern regions of Poland, into Podolia, Galicia, and Volhynia, and even reached the more remote settlements in the Carpathian foothills. Yet the charm of Besht was not confined to miraculous acts or the mechanical recitation of amulets and incantations. What captured the hearts of the people was his ability to communicate directly with their souls. Unlike the austere Lithuanian rabbis, whose authority rested on years of Talmudic scholarship and rigid social hierarchy, Besht spoke the language of the heart. He emphasized the joy of serving God, the power of heartfelt prayer, and the presence of the divine in every aspect of life. He told simple stories, illustrative parables, and sometimes even humorous anecdotes, showing that piety need not be grim or inaccessible. He offered a Judaism that was comprehensible, tangible, and emotionally sustaining. His growing influence attracted followers who, inspired by his teachings, began to cluster around him. These disciples, drawn both from the common folk and from some of the more open-minded scholars dissatisfied with traditional rabbinic authority, became the first Hasidim, the pious ones. To them, Besht was not merely a teacher, but a spiritual master, a Rebbe, whose insight into the hidden workings of God's world guided their lives. They would follow him on his journeys from village to village, carrying his reputation into towns where despair and hopelessness were commonplace. The Baal Shem Tov's methods were radical yet simple. He did not insist on scholarly training or rigorous memorization of the Talmud. Instead, he instructed that sincere devotion, heartfelt prayer, and ethical conduct were the keys to spiritual elevation. He encouraged the ordinary Jew, burdened with the hardships of daily existence, to embrace joy, to sing, to dance in devotion, and to believe in the personal care of God. In this manner, Besht effectively democratized spirituality, opening the gates of mystical and religious experience to every man, woman, and child who desired it. Even the scholars who had initially mocked him began to acknowledge the power of his presence and teachings. While Besht eschewed formal debate as the primary path to God, he was capable of engaging learned men in discussions based on the Kabbalah. In these conversations, he demonstrated that the secrets of divine life were not hidden in endless legalistic argumentation, but could be accessed through sincere faith and contemplation of the divine essence. This approach unsettled the older, Talmudic authorities in northern Poland, who perceived his growing influence as a threat to their traditional monopoly over Jewish learning and leadership. By the mid-18th century, Besht had created a movement that was spiritually vibrant and socially transformative. Communities that had previously been spiritually destitute now found hope and guidance. Hasidism offered an alternative to both the cold formalism of Lithuanian rabbinism and the morally dangerous mysticism exemplified by Sabbatianism and Frankism. It was a faith that lifted the spirit through joy, love of God, and fellowship among believers, all while remaining deeply rooted in the ethical and mystical traditions of Judaism. Besht's genius lay not only in his personal charisma and miraculous powers, but in his profound understanding of human need. He knew that after decades of suffering, mystical deception, and sectarian strife, the Jewish masses craved spiritual reassurance and intimacy with the divine. By presenting a path that combined Kabbalistic depth with heartfelt simplicity, Israel Baal Shem Tov bridged the gulf between the learned elite and the common folk, creating a movement that was at once mystical, ethical, and eminently human. As his reputation spread further, the seeds of Hasidism began to germinate across the towns and villages of Podolia, Galicia, and Volhynia. Young men and women traveled long distances to study under him, while entire communities were reshaped by the presence of his disciples. The movement's influence continued to expand, and the distinction between the northern, scholastic Jews and the southwestern, mystical Jews became more pronounced, setting the stage for both spiritual renewal and ideological tension within the Jewish world of Poland. The stage was now set for the rise of Hasidism as a dominant force in the religious life of Polish Jewry, offering hope, mystical insight, and heartfelt devotion in a world that had witnessed the disasters of Sabbatian fanaticism and the moral corruption of Frankist heresy. The Baal Shem Tov's life and teachings promised a Judaism that could reach every soul, heal every heart, and renew the spirit of a people long accustomed to suffering and oppression. About the year 1740, Israel Baal Shem Tov, known among his followers as the Master of the Good Name, chose for his permanent residence the small Podolian town of Medzibos. It was here that the role of sorcerer and miracle worker gradually faded into the background, and Besht emerged as a fully fledged teacher of religion. He established himself at the head of a growing circle of disciples and followers who were initiated into the mysteries of the new doctrine not through formal lectures or systematic study, but through stories, sayings, and parables, vivid fragments of wisdom handed down orally. The Baal Shem Tov himself left no written works. His teachings were preserved only in the memories and writings of his closest disciples. Two central ideas lay at the heart of Besht's Hasidic teaching, or doctrine of piety, as it came to be known. The first was the idea of pantheism, the belief in the omnipresence of God. Besht emphasized that God was present everywhere in all material things, and that every sight, every action, every event could be understood as a manifestation of the divine countenance. He urged his followers to bear this thought constantly in mind, so that their lives would be filled with devotion not only in the performance of formal religious rituals, but in every trivial action. Besht's second fundamental idea was drawn from the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition of Judaism. It held that there is a continuous interaction between the human world and the divine world. Human deeds and intentions influence the will and disposition of God, just as the divine will shapes human destiny. From these premises flowed the rest of Besht's doctrine. Communion with God was the ultimate goal of every truly pious individual. This communion was attained not primarily through study of the Talmud or legalistic arguments, but through the emotions, through heartfelt devotion, fervent prayer, and ecstatic enthusiasm. Prayer was not a quiet or measured recitation, but a living, intense experience in which the soul strove to cast off its material bonds and unite with the divine. To reach this ecstatic state, Besht encouraged physical expressions, movements of the body, shaking, clapping, stamping, and even loud shouts, all meant to shake off the world's constraints and open the spirit to God. While study of Jewish law and ethical texts was not discouraged, it was considered secondary, valuable only when it inspired the soul to devotion. Ethical and moral literature, emphasizing righteous conduct and loving kindness, was regarded as superior to legalistic Talmudic scholarship in cultivating the spiritual life. Contrary to the severe asceticism promoted by other schools of practical Kabbalah, Besht rejected excessive fasting, self-mortification, and rigid mortification of the body as not only unnecessary but sinful. The heart and mind of the devotee, he taught, were far more important than external ceremonies. Joy, cheerfulness, and an open, receptive spirit were virtues pleasing to God. The Hasid was to serve God not only through ritual observance, but in every thought, word, and action. By living in constant spiritual communion, a man could attain the extraordinary gifts of clairvoyance, prophecy, and miracle working. Central to this new movement was the role of the tzaddik, the righteous one. The tzaddik served as a bridge between God and the people, a spiritual guide whose closeness to the divine enabled the common person to attain purity, blessings, and salvation. In the eyes of the Hasidim, the tzaddik was more than a teacher. He was a living embodiment of divine favor, the focal point of spiritual life and the source of guidance for both the mundane and the mystical. The personality of the tzaddik, in fact, was often more influential than the doctrine itself, a fact that would shape the development of Hasidism for generations. Among Besht's closest and most influential disciples were Jacob Joseph Cohen, who served as rabbi successively in the towns of Shargorod, Nemirov, and Polonoi, Bear of Mezerik, a preacher and Kabbalist from Volhynia, and Naaman of Horodno, Naaman of Kosovo, and Phineas of Koretz, all of whom frequently sought counsel with the Baal Shem Tov in Medzabos. Even Gershon Kutover, the former rabbi of Brody and Besht's brother-in-law, who had once dismissed him as an ignoramus, came to recognize and respect his spiritual mission. By establishing Medzabos as a center of spiritual renewal, Israel Baal Shem Tov created a model of Jewish life that combined mysticism, joy, ethical conduct, and heartfelt devotion. The town became a gathering place for seekers of God, a site where the oppressed and spiritually hungry could find guidance, comfort, and inspiration. Besht's teachings, emphasizing faith, prayer, and the intercession of the tzaddik, laid the foundation for a movement that would profoundly transform Jewish religious life across the southwestern regions of Poland, Galicia, and Podolia, marking the emergence of Hasidism as a powerful, enduring force. Around the year 1750, Israel Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, sent a remarkable letter to his brother-in-law, Gershon Kutover, who by this time had settled in the Holy Land. This letter, which may be described as a prophetic manifesto, recounted a miraculous vision or revelation, which Besht claimed to have experienced. According to his account, on the day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, his soul had been lifted into the heavens, where he beheld the Messiah and the souls of the departed. When Besht had asked the Messiah in his vision, "Tell me, my master, when thou wilt appear upon the earth," the Messiah had answered with words that would echo in the hearts of all who believed in Besht. "This shall be a sign unto thee, when thy doctrine shall become known, and the fountains of thy wisdom shall be poured forth, when all other men shall have the power of performing the same mysteries as thyself. Then shall disappear all the hosts of impurity, and the time of great favor and salvation shall arrive." Revelations of this kind, filled with visions of heaven, spirits, and divine instruction, were immensely popular among mystically inclined Jews of the 18th century, and they stirred both awe and devotion. Among the people, the belief spread that Besht was in contact not only with the prophet Elijah, who in Jewish tradition is a harbinger of redemption, but also with the biblical seer Ahijah of Shiloh, renowned for his interpretations of the destiny of Israel. The common people came to revere Besht as a miracle worker, a holy teacher who did not discriminate between the learned elite and the ordinary Jew. Scholars and Kabbalists were captivated by his discourses, which transformed the most abstract principles of Kabbalistic mysticism into vivid parables, making them tangible, practical, and comprehensible to all. Besht's circle in Medzabos grew steadily. He witnessed the agitation and machinations of the Frankist sectarians in Podolia and their mass conversion to Catholicism, a controversial episode that had gripped the attention of the Polish rabbis. The rabbis rejoiced, for they believed the conversion of these dangerous heretics, led by Jacob Frank, had removed a malignant influence from the Jewish people. Besht, however, regarded the matter with profound sorrow, exclaiming, "I heard the Lord cry and say, as long as the diseased limb is joined to the body, there is hope that it may be cured in time. But when it has been cut off, it is lost forever." These words reflected his enduring hope that even the misled could return to the spiritual path. It is also likely that Besht, deeply concerned with the well-being of Jewish faith, had been among the rabbis invited to participate in the infamous Frankist disputation in Lemberg in the summer of 1759. In the spring of the following year, 1751, Israel Baal Shem Tov passed away, surrounded by his devoted disciples, leaving behind a legacy that had already begun to stir the hearts of the Jewish masses in Podolia, Galicia, and Volhynia. With Besh's passing, the seeds of Hasidism required nurturing and direction, and this task fell to his disciples, who became the architects of systematic Hasidic propaganda. The most prominent of these was Rabbi Ber of Mezerich, previously mentioned, who assumed the mantle of leadership. The town of Mezerich in Volhynia became the headquarters of Hasidism in that region, just as Medzabaz had served in Podolia. While Rabbi Ber could not match his master in originality or in the depth of spiritual sentiment, he far surpassed him in erudition, mastering the Talmudic and Kabbalistic texts in a way that enabled him to engage with learned Jews and ensure the acceptance of Hasidism among scholars. Between the years 1760 and 1772, Rabbi Ber assembled around him a significant number of prominent Talmudists, many of whom had been converts to Hasidism, including some who came from the rabbinical strongholds of Lithuania and White Russia. Under his guidance, the doctrine of Besht was further developed, with particular emphasis on the principle of tzadikism, the reverence for the righteous one, the intermediary between God and the people. Tzadikism appealed especially to the common people, who, instead of seeking rational understanding of religious truths, prefer to place their trust and devotion in a living guide, a man whose sanctity and wisdom mediated between the divine and the mundane. Rabbi Ber also trained a group of apostles who would go on to found Tzaddik dynasties throughout Poland and Lithuania, ensuring the geographic and spiritual expansion of Hasidism. Another of Besh's disciples, Jacob Joseph Cohen, played an equally vital role in spreading Hasidic thought. Cohen endured significant hardships for his devotion, including the loss of his rabbinical post in Shargorod due to his affiliation with Hasidism. With Besh's support, Cohen accepted a position as preacher in Nemirov, and later, following the death of his master, became preacher in Polonoi. Throughout these years, he tirelessly propagated Hasidic doctrine both orally and in writing, striving to reach Jews of all walks of life. In 1780, Jacob Joseph Cohen published a collection of sermons entitled Toldoth Yaakov Yosef. This work preserved many of the teachings and sayings of Besht, transmitting them to subsequent generations. In his writing, Cohen emphasized the centrality of the tzaddik, portraying these righteous figures as protectors and spiritual guides for the common people. At the same time, he harshly criticized the Talmudists whom he referred to as pseudo-scholars, men who, in his view, reduced religion to mere book learning and regarded the masses with disdain. Toldoth Yaakov Yosef laid the foundation of Hasidic literature, distinct not only from traditional rabbinical texts, but also from the more esoteric Kabbalistic writings that preceded it. It combined moral instruction, mystical thought, and practical guidance for daily living, framed around the figure of the tzaddik as both mediator and exemplar of divine favor. In this way, the work of Cohen and other disciples solidified the principles of Hasidism and ensured that the teachings of Israel Baal Shem Tov would not remain confined to Medzabaz, but would spread across the southwestern regions of the Polish-Lithuanian territories, transforming the spiritual life of countless Jews in the decades to come. By the final decades of the 18th century, Hasidism had spread like wildfire among the Jewish communities of Poland and even, to some extent, of Lithuania. In towns and villages, separate Hasidic congregations sprang up almost overnight. They established their own houses of prayer, often called shtibels, where services were unlike anything the Jewish world had seen before. These gatherings were animated by an energy and fervor that bordered on frenzy. Men and women shouted and gestured wildly, their voices rising and falling in ecstasy, while the whole assembly sometimes trembled with the intensity of its devotion. These practices were in accordance with the prescriptions left by Israel Baal Shem Tov, emphasizing ecstatic, heart-centered worship over intellectual analysis or ritual exactitude. The Hasidim adopted a special prayer book derived from the mystical teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, which differed from the standard Jewish liturgy in many textual details and rearrangements. They often disregarded traditional limits for the morning prayers, adjusted the rules for ritual slaughter of animals, and some even dressed in white garments on the Sabbath, symbolizing spiritual purity and divine joy. Noonday meetings could easily spill over into raucous gatherings, sometimes ending in noisy drinking bouts, which Besht had sanctioned as a way to maintain a cheerful spirit, for he taught that a joyful heart was a conduit to God. Yet the most striking and defining feature of Hasidism was the veneration of the Tzaddik, the Righteous One. Though theoretically a consequence of Besht's doctrine, in practice Tzaddikism often preceded the adoption of Hasidic beliefs. The arrival of a miracle-working tzaddik in a town or village could bring entire communities under the sway of Hasidism. People flocked to the tzaddik's home, seeking cures for illness, remedies for infertility, blessings for success, predictions of the future, or advice on mundane affairs. If even a single prophecy proved true or a single sick person recovered, the tzaddik's reputation was cemented, and local populations often converted wholesale to Hasidism. The number of tzaddiks grew steadily during this period, especially among the disciples of Be'er of Mezrich. Each tzaddik either interpreted Besht's teachings in a slightly different way or adapted his teachings to the customs of his local population, resulting in a rapid diversification of Hasidic practice. Over time, two principal branches emerged. One dominated Poland and Ukraine, and the other was centered in Lithuania and White Russia. This commercialized form of spiritual mediation became highly effective. People brought their last coins to the tzaddik, who, in turn, dispensed blessings, healed the sick, cured infertility, and offered guidance for everyday life. Tzaddikship often became hereditary, passing from father to son or grandfather to grandson, and petty dynasties of tzaddiks arose, competing for prominence and influence. What had begun as a mystical, heart-centered faith evolved, in many cases, into a materialistic and hierarchical institution. Yet not all tzaddiks fell into this pattern of worldly indulgence or commercialized spirituality. Some remained true to the idealism and benevolence of Besht himself. One such figure was Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev, who in his youth had been persecuted by the rigid Lithuanian rabbis for his devotion to Hasidism. By the end of the 18th century, he had established himself in Berdichev as a tzaddik of extraordinary popularity, renowned for his saintly character and deep paternal care for the common people. He exemplified the possibility of combining spiritual authority with genuine compassion. In general, however, the Ukrainian, Podolian, and Galician tzaddiks shared a common tendency. They taught blind, unwavering faith in Hasidic truths, discouraging speculation and rational inquiry as dangerous distractions from religious devotion. The emotional, mystical, and personal connection to the tzaddik became the central pillar of Hasidic life, ensuring that, for many, devotion to the living righteous one was valued far above scholarly learning or ritual precision. In this way, the last decades of the 18th century saw Hasidism grow from a small circle of followers in Podolia into a mass movement that reshaped Jewish spiritual life across large portions of Eastern Europe. In Lithuania and White Russia, the spread of Hasidism followed a path markedly different from that of the southern provinces. In the south, in Podolia, Galicia, and Volhynia, Hasidism could sweep entire communities into its embrace with little resistance, the dry, scholastic representatives of rabbinism largely powerless to oppose the fervor of the masses. In the north, however, the movement encountered formidable opposition. The Kahal, the traditional Jewish communal organization, wielded enormous influence, administering both religious and civil affairs within the Jewish community. Here, Hasidism was forced to fight for survival, negotiating not only belief, but also its very existence amidst the well-entrenched authority of the rabbinic establishment. It was in this crucible of intellectual rigor and communal discipline that Hasidism assumed a distinctly northern character. The teachings of Israel Baal Shem Tov, carried into the north by his disciples Be'er of Mezrich, Aaron of Karlin, Mendel of Vitebsk, and Zalman of Lady, could not escape the influence of the dominant rabbinic thought. In absorbing these elements, Northern Hasidism acquired a more intellectual and rational coloring. Among its most prominent exponents was Zalman Schneerson, who died in the year 1813, initially from the town of Lozno and later from Lady, both situated within the government of Mogilev. Zalman created a remarkable synthesis of Hasidic fervor and rigorous intellectual inquiry, which he summarized in the Hebraic maxim, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. He embraced the mystical doctrines of Besht while insisting that religious faith could and should be examined through reason. According to Zalman, the tzaddik was not primarily a miracle worker or charismatic wonder worker, but a teacher of religion and guide to spiritual understanding. He purged Hasidism of many of the crude superstitions that had sometimes accompanied its southern practice, replacing the naive exuberance of Besht's original teachings with careful contemplation and rational insight. This adaptation made Hasidism acceptable to the more educated and philosophically minded Jews of the North, though it never gained much traction in the southern regions, where the simple, ecstatic forms of worship remained dominant. Meanwhile, the southern triumph of Hasidism had not gone unnoticed by the rabbinical authorities. Rabbinism had long perceived Hasidism as a mortal threat to its authority. The central tenet of Besht's teaching, that salvation lay in heartfelt faith rather than in scholarly knowledge, directly contradicted the fundamental principle of rabbinism, which measured a man's religious worth by the depth of his Talmudic learning. In the eyes of the rabbis, the tzaddik represented a dangerous rival, a popular religious figure who drew the masses away from traditional study and ritual, feeding upon the credulity and superstition of the people. The lower classes of the Jewish population, who often could not comprehend the abstract and intricate arguments of the Talmudist, were naturally drawn to the charismatic tzaddik. He offered not only practical guidance and protection from misfortune, but also blessings that promise salvation of both soul and body. In the South, Rabbinism was overwhelmed, unable to contend with the popular appeal of the miracle-working tzaddik. In the North, however, Rabbinism still held sway and reacted with extraordinary rigor, declaring what was, in effect, a campaign of spiritual warfare against Hasidism. At the forefront of northern opposition was Elijah of Vilna, born in the year 1720 and passing away in the year 1797. He bore the exalted title of Jayan, a term denoting an exceptional scholar, a prodigy of Jewish learning whose intellect was shaped by the rigorous reasoning of Talmudic study. Elijah displayed his extraordinary talents early. By the age of 6, he could read and comprehend Talmudic texts without the guidance of a teacher. By 10, he participated in complex Talmudic debates, astonishing older rabbis with the precision and depth of his erudition. His mind absorbed knowledge with almost superhuman rapidity, spanning the Talmud, Kabbalistic texts, and even the rudiments of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, allowing him to follow discussions that intertwined religious law and scientific observation. Elijah lived in Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, as a recluse. He adhered to an austere, almost ascetic lifestyle, subsisting on minimal nourishment, sleeping no more than 2 hours per night, and limiting his contact with the outside world almost entirely to delivering Talmudic lectures to his pupils. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided the method of pilpul, a complex dialectical system that exercised the mind through intricate reasoning over hypothetical contradictions in the Talmud. Elijah's mastery of Jewish law was such that he could solve the most challenging questions without such contrivances, guided instead by subtle critical insight. Elijah authored commentaries, annotations, and interpretations of biblical, Talmudic, and Kabbalistic texts. His style, however, was terse, elusive, and intended primarily for the erudite. It was accessible only to those who had achieved a high degree of scholarly training. In his spare moments, he even wrote about Hebrew grammar and mathematics. For him, rigorous study was the essence of religion. In matters of ritual, he was uncompromising, adding restrictions to the already exacting regulations of the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of Jewish law compiled by Rabbi Joseph Caro in the 16th century. The Jain of Vilna was adored and revered by the learned rabbis of Lithuania and beyond, yet he remained largely incomprehensible to the common people. As a spiritual aristocrat, Elijah Jain viewed Hasidism with contempt. It offended not only the Talmudic scholar in him, but also the strict ascetic and the guardian of ceremonial exactitude. He disdained the Hasidic innovations, the ecstatic worship, the veneration of the tzaddik, and the playful alterations to ritual practices. In his eyes, the Hasidim represented a dangerous erosion of the rigor, discipline, and purity of traditional Judaism, and he was prepared to wage war against them for the preservation of the sacred intellectual and moral heritage of the Jewish people. The stage was thus set for a monumental confrontation. On one side, the disciplined, scholarly, and uncompromising authority of Elijah of Vilna and the Lithuanian rabbis. On the other, the fervent, ecstatic, and rapidly expanding movement of Hasidism, rooted in the teachings of Israel Baal Shem Tov and carried forward by the miracle-working tzaddiks of the south and the rationally minded leaders of the north. The struggle was not merely one of doctrine, but of influence, authority, and the soul of Eastern European Jewry itself. By the year 1772, the first clandestine Hasidic societies had taken root in Lithuania. These secret gatherings, devoted to the mystical doctrines of Israel Baal Shem Tov, attracted the attention of the local authorities. In the city of Vilna, the rabbinical kahal, the governing body of the Jewish community, discovered several leaders of these societies. Acting with the authority granted to them by Elijah of Vilna, the Jain, the kahal pronounced a hurim, a formal excommunication and religious censure against the Hasidic sectarians. The hurim was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a call to action, demanding that all Jews reject Hasidism entirely. From Vilna, circulars were dispatched to rabbis throughout the northern provinces, urging them to wage an uncompromising campaign against what they termed the godless sect. In many towns of Lithuania, the Hasidim became the object of relentless persecution. The rabbis of Galicia, having been forewarned by the Vilna authorities, quickly followed suit. At a meeting held in Brody during the bustling fair of the city, they issued a sweeping hurim against anyone participating in Hasidic worship, observing the altered rituals, dressing in white on Sabbaths and festivals, or attending the secret assemblies of the Hasidim. In this hostile environment, the Hasidim were ostracized socially, denied basic communal rights, and forced to live under the constant shadow of rabbinical disapproval. The publication of Jacob Joseph Cohen's work, Toldoth Yaakov Yosef, in the year 1780, inflamed the situation further. Cohen, an ardent disciple of Besht, reproduced many of Besht's sayings and parables and offered pointed criticism of what he described as the scholastic pseudo-wisdom of the rabbis. The text provoked outrage among the rabbinical elite. In the following year, 1781, the rabbis of Lithuania convened at the Fair of Zelva in the government of Grodno. There, they resolved to apply the strictest measures against the Hasidim, whom they call the dishonorable followers of Besht, the destroyer of Israel. Every Orthodox Jew was summoned to observe a strict ostracism. The Hasidim were to be treated as infidels, avoided socially, barred from intermarriage, and denied communal rights, including burial. These opponents of the Hasidim, who came to be known as the Mithnagdim or Protestants, viewed their adversaries as dangerous heretics, threatening the very foundations of traditional Judaism. The growth of Hasidism in White Russia, particularly under the leadership of Zalman Schneerson, intensified the agitation. At rabbinical conferences held in Mogilev and Shklov, severe measures were formally adopted against the Hasidim, and Zalman himself was officially declared a heretic. Despite his efforts to defend his piety and orthodoxy, Zalman's letters to the rabbis were dismissed, and even a personal petition to Elijah Jain in Vilna was rebuffed. The revered Jain refused to grant him an audience. By the close of the 18th century, The conflict between Hasidism and Rabbinism in Russian Jewry had escalated to a crisis that would soon invite the intervention of the Russian imperial authorities. Despite their bitter conflict, Rabbinism and Hasidism found a rare, though negative, point of convergence in their mutual opposition to the rising tide of secular Enlightenment thought emanating from the Mendelssohn Circle in Berlin. The Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, encouraged the study of secular subjects, philosophy, and the languages of Europe, which posed a direct challenge to both traditionalist schools. Rabbinism actively resisted this movement, perceiving it as a competitor for authority over the Jewish mind. Hasidism opposed it passively, not with argument, but through its inherent promotion of mental drowsiness, ecstatic ritual, and what could be called pious fraud. The tzaddiks, especially, were instinctively hostile to secular learning. While Rabbinism had entrenched the Jewish intellect in the stagnant waters of scholasticism, Hasidism sought to lull rational thought entirely into slumber, nurturing the imagination and emotions of the faithful at the expense of reason. In this dark cultural landscape, only a few daring individuals dared to seek knowledge beyond the prescribed religious texts, and they often had to flee to foreign lands to pursue intellectual growth. Among these rare exiles was Solomon Maimon, born in the year 1754, the son of a village arrender or leaseholder in Lithuania near the town of Nesvish in the government of Minsk. Like thousands of other Jewish children, Maimon received a traditional Talmudic education. By the age of 12, he was married, as dictated by custom, to a girl chosen by his parents. Yet unlike most, he possessed a restless, searching mind that refused to settle for the narrow confines of Talmudic scholarship. Maimon's intellectual curiosity led him from the Talmud to the mystical Kabbalah, where he initially became deeply absorbed. But the intellectual hunger within him could not be sated by mystical formulas alone. He leapt from Kabbalistic studies to the writings of Maimonides, the medieval Jewish philosopher and legal scholar, and other rationalist thinkers of the Jewish tradition. Dissatisfied with the intellectual sterility of his immediate environment, he left home in the year 1777, seeking the broad horizons of European thought. He wandered through Germany, visiting Königsberg, the city where Immanuel Kant taught philosophy, then to Berlin, Posen, Hamburg, and Breslau. Throughout his travels, Maimon endured extreme hardship. He faced poverty, dislocation, and the harsh isolation of life in foreign cities. In Berlin, he finally encountered the circle of Moses Mendelssohn, the German Jewish philosopher and champion of Enlightenment thought. Under Mendelssohn's tutelage and within his vibrant intellectual circle, Maimon rapidly mastered German literature, science, and philosophy, particularly the revolutionary system of thought advanced by Immanuel Kant. Here, far from the mystical forests of Podolia and the austere academies of Lithuania, Maimon found the freedom to pursue reason, critical inquiry, and secular knowledge, the very pursuits that the Hasidic tzaddiks and the Lithuanian rabbis had sought to suppress. It was in this confrontation of worlds, between mystical fervor and rational inquiry, between the miracle-working tzaddik and the disciplined scholar, between Hasidic faith and Haskalah reason, that the cultural and spiritual landscape of Eastern European Jewry in the late 18th century was being irreversibly reshaped. The abrupt and violent transition that Solomon Maimon experienced, from the rigid, book-bound world of rabbinic scholasticism to the bold and uncharted realm of German critical philosophy, shattered the delicate equilibrium of his mind. Born into the narrow, regulated existence of a Lithuanian Jew, he had been raised among the austere customs of village life, the endless cycles of Talmudic study, and the unrelenting authority of the rabbi. In Germany, however, he found himself immersed in a culture of free thought, secular learning, and intellectual exploration, where the human mind was encouraged to question, doubt, and seek knowledge without constraint. This sudden liberation of intellect, instead of comforting him, plunged Maimon into the abyss of skepticism. He began to doubt the foundations of all religion, morality, and traditional authority. His once disciplined mind, accustomed to the precise reasoning of the Talmud and the spiritual guidance of mysticism, now oscillated in uncertainty. He lived a disorderly life, indulging in impulses that estranged him from his closest friends and mentors. In his philosophical critiques, he did not merely challenge the rationality of religious dogma. He pushed beyond the boundaries of Immanuel Kant's own critical system, venturing into metaphysical territories that few of his contemporaries could comprehend. In the year 1790, Maimon published in German a tentative investigation of transcendental philosophy, a groundbreaking work that dissected the principles of Kantian philosophy with extraordinary depth and subtlety. The publication sent ripples through the philosophical world. Even Immanuel Kant himself, upon reading Maimon's first book, remarked with admiration, "No one among my opponents has grasped the essence of my system as profoundly as Maimon, nor are there altogether many men endowed with so refined and penetrating a mind in questions so abstract and complex." 2 years later, in 1792, Maimon published his autobiography, known in German as Lebensgeschichte. This remarkable work was far more than a personal narrative. It was a vivid chronicle of the conditions of Jewish life in Poland and Lithuania during the 18th century, seen through the eyes of a man torn between two worlds. Maimon recounted the oppressive narrowness of village life, the suffocating rigidity of rabbinic authority, and the desperate spiritual longing of a people caught between tradition and the unknown. The book also traced his personal odyssey, from his early education, through his mystical encounters with the Kabbalah, to his encounters with European philosophers and the harsh realities of exile. It captured both the internal turmoil of a prodigious mind and the wider social and religious ferment of his time. The autobiography made a profound impression on the educated Christian world, attracting admirers such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German poet and playwright, and Friedrich Schiller, the philosopher and dramatist, who recognized in Maimon a mind both brilliant and tragically alienated. In his final years, Maimon retreated to Silesia, living on the estate of his friend, Count Friedrich von Kockruth. Here, away from the chaotic and constricting world of Jewish communities, he continued his philosophical studies, exploring logic, metaphysics, and critical thought. He died in the year 1800 and was buried in the town of Głogów. By the end of his life, he was entirely estranged from Judaism, having abandoned the mystical, rabbinic, and Hasidic worlds that had shaped his youth. His contributions to the intellectual enlightenment of his fellow Jews were minimal. The only work he left in Hebrew, an incomplete commentary on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, remained unfinished. Maimon had escaped the realm of darkness that confined so many of his contemporaries, but he could never return. The intellectual and spiritual liberation he had achieved came at a cost, a permanent estrangement from the very community that had nurtured him. For the Jews of Poland and Lithuania, the time for cultural and intellectual rejuvenation had not yet arrived. External circumstances compounded their difficulties. The disintegration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had resulted in the partitioning of their lands by neighboring powers. The largest portion of the Jewish population, once living under the declining Polish state, had been transferred to the dominion of the Russian Empire, a state even more autocratic, less enlightened, and rigidly structured upon the foundations of serfdom. In this oppressive environment, the spiritual and intellectual energies of the Jewish people were circumscribed, bound tightly by external control and internal conflict. The mystical ecstasies of Hasidism, the rigid orthodoxy of the Lithuanian rabbis, and the abstract rationalism of exiled thinkers such as Solomon Maimon existed simultaneously, yet without converging. The result was a fragmented cultural landscape, a people yearning for enlightenment and emancipation, yet constrained by centuries of superstition, rigid authority, and the heavy hand of political oppression. The stage was set for a new era, one in which the competing forces of mysticism, orthodoxy, and rational thought would collide, each striving to define the future of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. The footnotes attached to this historical account reveal the extraordinary richness, depth, and complexity of Jewish life in Eastern Europe during the 18th century. Each note points to a world full of scholarship, mysticism, and human drama, and provides a window into the lives, works, and customs of the people who lived through these turbulent times. Some of these notes clarify terms that might seem opaque to modern readers. For instance, the word shamus, noted in footnote 172, refers to the synagogue beadle, a minor but indispensable officer of the Jewish congregation who carried out daily duties ranging from cleaning the synagogue to assisting with services.